Asymmetrical Haircuts Justice Update with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
A couple of weeks ago, we took a stab at understanding the new special tribunal for aggression against Ukraine.
Yeah, you did an interview with Kostin, who is the former Prosecutor General of Ukraine and now ambassador in the Netherlands. And that really helped us understand what Ukraine wants to get out of it, why it accepted all the various compromises in the way that the statute is put together.
Yeah, at some point, maybe we should do more of a documentary approach on how the new special tribunal for aggression in Ukraine got created, include things like the discussions we had with Gabia and Christian Venewasser and the interview with Kostin. Gabia and Christian, of course, are the diplomats who midwife the aggression tribunal to some extent.
And as we'll come to probably a bit later, we know that they are part of the hardcore, the core group, with one side of things, and then there were some other people on the other side. But just to let you know, that's coming up later. But today we're going to try to understand a bit more about the pressures put on the negotiations, how exactly immunity for these three most senior officials, that's, if I'm correct, Steph, do correct me if necessary, the President, Head of State and Foreign Minister would still apply while in office. But we're going to kick off with the whole discussion around how they got to accepting trials in absentia. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for a Stephopedia on trials in absentia.
Yeah, this is where I regurgitate everything I know about trials in absentia. As trials in absentia are very rare in international law, and international courts tend not to have them, with one exception, which I'll get to. In national, especially civil law countries, you have a lot more trials in absentia. In the Netherlands, it's not rare. And in Ukraine also, they have trials in absentia. So you're having a trial without the accused, but they are being represented by lawyers who represent their interests. Where have we seen trials in absentia in international law? Famously, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon had trials in absentia. We had an whole episode about that with Nathalie von Wistinghausen, and we will refer to that in the show notes. In the Netherlands, as I said, trials in absentia are quite normal. And for example, you saw the MH17 case of the plane that was downed by pro-Russian rebels above parts of Ukraine. That was also done in absentia. And at the ICC, we have just finished these CONI in absentia hearings for confirmation of charges. So that is not an entirely in absentia trial, but it is a part of the ICC procedure where they kind of flesh out the charges and have judges decide if prosecutors can bring these charges. That was done without the accused present, lawyers acting for CONI, but not on his instruction because they haven't met him. Wanted the judges to still defer the decision on the charges, making the argument that it's in absentia, so they can't really represent him properly. Judges said, no, we're going to go ahead and confirm these charges. That was just this week or last week, so that's fairly recently.
Yeah, I mean, lots of different forms of in absentia there. And I think we're going to get a bit more into the nub of how you can make it really acceptable. But as part of your chatting on the side of an International Bar Association conference in The Hague, you were listening to a panel, as aforementioned, with André Kostin, but also with Mark Ellis, the head of the IBA. And so we've taken the interview that you did with Mark and taken out, all of it was really interesting, but taken out the most interesting bits. And we're just going to talk through them. So the first thing I picked out from there is that you suggested to Mark, and he agreed with you, that holding trials in absentia in international courts is actually always quite a contentious thing.
International law generally leans towards a scenario where the requirement is for the individual, the suspect, the accused, to face the trial. And that's just the foundation of international law, whether it's International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, or the Council of Europe. The litany of international instruments that say this is the default position, that you have to have the individual in court. And in fact, the system I come from, a common law system, generally prohibits trials unless the suspect is there in person. So you're talking about a fairly uphill battle in some ways of getting to a point where you, in essence, could undertake these trials in absentia. So in the civil law systems, there is recognition that you can undertake these trials in absentia, but you can do so under very strict standards, protections, safeguards. And those would include generally three: that you have to have effective notice. You really have to do a significant number of steps to make certain that the individual, the suspect, is aware of the indictment and knows that he or she is being called in for a trial. So you have to really show that you've done that. Second, you've got to give effective representation to that individual. Even though the individual is not in court, you would still need to have a representation. And third, you'd have to have a retrial if later on the accused is apprehended.
So here's where we start to get into the nitty-gritty of the statute of the new Special Tribunal on Aggression against Ukraine. And we start off with this issue of trials in absentia, how exactly that would work. Then later we turn to the immunity issue, and we covered this in the last podcast with Anton Kostin. But here we really discussed how the statute reflects the current state of play on immunity. Then we look at the specific role of the United States in the negotiations for the tribunal, but also how the special tribunal might actually feature in any peace deal that might be imposed or done by the United States on, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So much more to come, but first, let's go back to trials in absentia. Would there actually be a possibility in this tribunal that somebody turns up later and gets a retrial? And you really honed in on what is said in the statute and how it sees that potential right by the accused, for a full retrial. Here's Mark.
The most important thing is that there has to be a recognition that the accused has not appeared in front of the trial, has an opportunity for a retrial. But there are exceptions to that, of course. The individual may have, from the very start, have said, I'm aware of the trial coming up. I refuse to attend. I have no intention of attending. That would be very different. There's no interest. There's no right then, in essence, for a retrial on that. So the emphasis is here. You need to provide an opportunity for an individual at that point who otherwise did not have the fair trial right of being in the trial, to give him that right. And that's all they're doing on this.
And he noted in your interview that Ukraine, of course, is particularly comfortable with this. Ukraine is already allowing trials in absentia. It's been holding trials. And he came out with a statistic. I'm not too sure. I haven't seen this before. It'd be interesting to try and confirm it. That he said that domestic war crimes trials in Ukraine are, more than 90% of them are trials in absentia. So because of this, he said the tribunal also sees that trials in absentia is just the practical way of going.
Because of the unlikeliness of having these individuals, these very top political and military individuals that were in the position of authority to plan or prepare, initiate, execute these acts of aggression, the chances are those individuals are not going to soon be brought in and apprehended. So for the sake of justice, for the sake of victims, I think allowing these trials in absentia is correct.
And parallel with the in absentia thing is, of course, the immunity thing.
Oh, yes, the immunity thing. We did that once before. We're not sure whether we got it exactly right. So eagle-eared listeners can write in or can comment and tell us. Go ahead.
As we said before, we're going to have to do something separate about this. But very broadly, it comes down to there is immunity for heads of state, heads of government, and a foreign minister, which is a pretty standard thing in international law. But that has been chipped away at by a ruling from the ICJ that says that the international courts, quote unquote, can ignore that immunity that the Troika have from prosecution when it comes to the international crimes like genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. And this is where Mark begins his explanation.
If trials in absentia are controversial, the whole issue of immunities, head of state immunity, is certainly that. I think you have to first start with there's a very solid customary law acceptance of head of state immunity, and head of state immunity is generally for the troika that we talk about, and it's generally geared towards countries who have an interest in bringing to justice individuals from another country, and generally that's prohibited. But there is an exception, and the exception that has emerged is this idea of international criminal courts. So the emergence of the International Criminal Court or courts that are created by the Security Council that then allowed these courts to say, we do not recognize head of state immunity. So if it's considered an international court, then you don't have to adhere to this customary international principle of recognizing head of state immunity. And of course, that would have been a debate within the creation of this tribunal, whether or not we were creating a tribunal that could be seen as international. And certainly it is international.
And then, of course, you get into what we were discussing together at one point, which was degrees of internationalness. Because Kostin was saying in the interview that you did with him how very important it was for the Ukrainian state that this new special tribunal not be Ukrainian, which would be national, but that would come under the auspices of something else that would be international, which is why it is the Council of Europe.
Mark continues here, but as he makes clear, in the end, this was actually an academic debate.
Is it international enough to where the court could say, we don't recognize head of state immunity? And that would have been and I know it was, that would have been a really significant debate about, well, what are the parameters? What's the foundation? What's the right number to determine whether or not this is in fact truly an international tribunal that could follow in the footsteps of the ICC or the tribunals for Rwanda or Yugoslavia? But in the end, it didn't really matter, because that would have been an academic debate, because fundamentally there were countries, particularly the G7 countries, that said we are not willing to step beyond what has been the customary international law protections in recognizing head of state immunity. And that was a compromise. That was the compromise that I think had to occur.
Even though, as far as I understand, in the statute, it does say in Article 4 of the statute that this court does not recognize head of state immunity. Full stop. They had to have a compromise between the kind of states like Lithuania and Liechtenstein, who we've had on the pod before, who were representing the hardcore states, the core states, who said, look, we have to go down the line of no immunity, and the others who were essentially those who were in the G7 who had a different point of view.
That was the compromise that I think had to occur had the court, and there were core state parties, they were referred to as hardcore states, that were adamant that the head of state immunity should not be recognized. Much of civil society argued the same way. But the reality is, if you had this other significant group of countries, particularly in the G7, that had said clearly, we will not support a tribunal that did not recognize head of state immunity, then you were faced with the question, do we move the tribunal forward, or does it end now? And I think the decision was the right decision. We have to move forward. It's not perfect, but we have to move forward. It's fascinating that the negotiations that took place, because de jure, legally, when you read the statute, Article 4, is very clear. Article 4 of the statute does not recognize head of state immunity. So I think that was really important to put in the statute, the fact that this tribunal, simply from a legal point of view, doesn't recognize it. That's important too, because it continues to add to this growing, I think this journey that we're taking in international law, that I think will eventually get to a point where simply head of state immunity is no longer recognized. But we're not there yet. But I think this was an important step.
But in the end, he says the compromise really came into play.
And the compromise was, well, we may legally not recognize it, but de facto, in fact, we're going to recognize it. And that's where the statute says, when it comes to investigations, even indictments against the Troika, the tribunal can do that. It can move in that direction. So that's important. But when it comes to the point of getting confirmation that you would need at the pretrial judge level, and that pretrial judge would confirm an indictment, and then you're able to move on with arrest warrant. That's where the statute says no. It creates a wall, and the pretrial judge must suspend any further actions on this indictment, until the individual loses his or her personal immunity protection. And that generally means can no longer be in office. As long as the individual is in office, that's what head of state immunity is for the Troika. They're protected under this principle. Once they leave the office, they're no longer protected under head of state immunity. They continue to be protected under functional immunity, but here too, the statute says we're not going to recognize functional immunity either.
So what we have here are the politics of big states, the UK, France, and the US, saying so far, but no further, because otherwise it could cause us problems, versus the small states who really would like to have proper legal precedent.
I think those who teach law will go back to this scenario and go, well, this is a remarkable example of where you incorporate kind of legal principles, legal standards, but the political part of this is very much in play. And this was clearly what happened. So I think it was an important compromise in relations to Article 4 that in essence does not recognize head of state immunity. That may not be important in a broad audience, but I think for legal practitioners, and for me included, I think that was very important to have that set in the statute. Now you flip the coin, and now you're in the political world, and the political nature of this is very different. And that's where you get this compromise of saying, well, we're going to recognize head of state immunity by fact with the Troika. So that's what was needed in order to ensure that the major G7 countries would support the tribunal.
And of course, inevitably, Steph, you decided to speculate on whether this new special tribunal would decide to actually, upend its own statute, and whether the judges would later rule themselves that, okay, the statute says this, but we think we have this jurisdiction, and we say in our statute already there's no immunity, so we're just going to use that back door. But Mark said no.
I don't see that within the statute is the statute, and it's quite clear as to the issue of personal head of state immunity and functional immunity. So the answer would be no on that. I think it's also important the statute does not recognize functional immunity, because it suggests that once the individual leaves office, what has happened in the past is that, well, you can leave office, but you can still argue that what I did was part of the function of my office. And if you can show that, you can prove that, then you have immunity for that as well. Because functional immunity is created so that it doesn't penalize somebody in authority who is simply doing his job and acting in his official capacity. But the direction of law has been, well, functional immunity can't possibly mean that you can create or commit war crimes or crimes against humanity, or for this case, aggression. So I think this statute also is very important when it clearly sets out that it doesn't recognize functional immunity. That's an important step as well.
And I also asked about what role the US played behind the scenes, because this is always fascinating. What is going on behind the scenes that they come up with these compromises, like with the negotiations over the Rome Statute for the ICC in 1998. The US was right there suggesting, pressuring, engaging.
Yeah, the U.S., I think, for this special tribunal played a very active and supportive role during the Biden administration. Now, I think we have to take a step back and say the United States has always had a very complicated relationship when it comes to international justice. This is my opinion, and particularly with the International Criminal Court. There is kind of a U.S. exceptionalism that exists. I don't agree with it, but it exists, and history shows this time and time again, where the United States, well, says, we think those principles are very solid principles for everyone but us. And that's how it works. However, for the tribunal here, I remember in Lviv being there one time when the core group was there talking about these issues. The United States was there in force. And so I think they were not only active, but very supportive of this process. Then President Donald Trump is elected. There's no surprise there because Trump had already made it very clear in his first term that he had no interest in supporting not just the International Criminal Court, but generally any international accountability system. And this clearly was based on this exceptionalism position that Trump holds. And so it was a complete withdrawal from any involvement, no longer a core group member, and in essence, as far as I know, no engagement at all, as far as I know. But unlike the International Criminal Court and its relationship with the United States, where the United States has been active to hamper the operations of the ICC through its now sanctions that we're watching emerge, even to the point, I think, of trying to destroy the International Criminal Court. I think that's the intention. You've not seen the same reaction to the creation of this special tribunal for the crime of aggression. The United States has been silent. You don't really hear much. It may be because the Trump administration has lots of other things that they're trying to focus on, and this is not a priority. Maybe if it becomes a priority, maybe they turn their attention to it. But I think we should embrace this silence because it's not an engagement, but it's not trying to destroy the tribunal. I think for right now, that's good.
One of the things I was speculating about also was if this special tribunal might thrive because it's not the ICC. Maybe Ukraine could take advantage of the fact that this is not the ICC and avoid Washington's annoyance at any cooperation with the ICC by dealing and promoting the Special Tribunal for Aggression instead. But Mark disagreed with my cynical view of, I guess, accountability politics.
Well, it's not too cynical, it's too optimistic. I don't see it that way. I see these as disconnected. The United States Trump's view on the ICC is driven primarily by the ICC's arrest warrants against Netanyahu. That was the catalyst to that. The United States never liked the fact that the ICC had put any attention on Afghanistan in relations to the U.S.'s actions there. This is all part of this criticism towards any international justice system that would somehow affect the United States. And this is one of the real problems the United States has with the ICC. The United States says, we're not a state party, but yet whether you're a state party or not, you could still be brought into the ICC's jurisdiction. The Special Court of Tribunal is completely separate. It really doesn't have anything to do with the United States. Its mandate is very structured. It's against one act that doesn't involve the United States. So I don't see that necessarily as shifting any positive support for tribunal, a special tribunal. Where I do think it can be problematic is if the United States is silent now, but let's suppose that things move actively, aggressively towards some type of settlement between Russia and Ukraine. I don't see it right now. There's not much attempt in that. But I do think there's a concern. I have a concern that if that's the direction it heads, and there is some agreement, and this tribunal is hanging about, it's kind of on the peripheral, but it's there. This is where the United States, because Trump would absolutely want to be part of any settlement, and whether he is or not, he'll take credit for it. Yes, 8 wars. This would be the 9th or 10th. I don't think anyone knows what those wars are, but in his mind, he thinks he knows. So, and this is where my fear is the tribunal could be sacrificed for the sake of some type of settlement on that. This is where the United States would play a role on this. But for right now, I see it as two completely different arenas, and where I think the United States will continue to focus on the ICC. Again, their silence concerning the special tribunal suggests to me that it's just not a concern for them right now. Again, it could be. It could get that way. If Vladimir Putin says to Trump, if they come back to speaking to each other, I'm willing to make a deal, but I'm not going to. This special tribunal needs to go. Trump he'll switch completely, and he'll go on the attack. But we're not there yet.
So last week on the pod, we were also considering about the deported children from Ukraine and how they might also become an issue during any bigger peace negotiations. Not that we can see that likely to happen right at the moment. But, now in this context, we also started to wonder whether the special tribunal might come into play in those kind of negotiations.
So I asked if there was now a sense of urgency, knowing that these tribunals, these accountability mechanisms, take quite a long time to be set up. And if they have a sense of we need to do it right now before it might get kind of nullified in peace negotiations.
It's a great question, and for me, there is an urgency for this tribunal to be established, and I think there are 2 reasons for me on why this has to happen. Perhaps 3 actually. Well, first and foremost, has to be for the victims. I mean, they have to see that the international community is reacting to this horrendous, heinous attack by Russia. And I think victims deserve that. And so that would be one reason to move it along. Second, it's an important benchmark for the international community. This tribunal is, yes, it's important for Ukraine. It's certainly important for the victims, as I've just said, but it reflects on the international community as to holding account those individuals who have perpetrated the most heinous crime, the crime of aggression. That reflects on the international community. And so there shouldn't be any delay on that. If we don't have a mechanism like this tribunal to hold Vladimir Putin and others accountable for these crimes, we never will. This is the case. This is the scenario. There's never been any other thing like it since World War II. If we can't achieve it now, we're not going to achieve it. And thirdly, it needs to happen now, because what I alluded to, if the tribunal is on the table and it's functioning and it's operational, it's much more difficult to take it off the table when you're trying to negotiate something. If it's not on the table and you're in some type of negotiations, it's quite easy to say, well, okay, we're not going to put that on. That would be the third reason why I'd want to see it moving and why there's urgency for it.
I think it was really good to have that kind of in-depth discussion. Def, thank you so much for pinning Mark down and asking the questions there. Of course, this isn't the last time we'll be discussing the special tribunal. What's your best guess as to when we might actually see some kind of a meeting, getting states to sign up, not sign up, and to get it launched? Are you hearing anything, for example, from the Dutch about their state of readiness to have a special tribunal in The Hague?
Well, I heard that the Dutch foreign minister was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago and said kind of definitely this court can be in The Hague. So that is, my reason for living near The Hague kind of confirmed for the coming couple of years. We will still have some kind of international court that I can cover. But I think they're going to open up, I think, the register to sign up for and pledge money for this court in December. And we really kind of have to see who's going to sign up for it. I think it's obviously the core group who agreed to it, but we have a lot of political changes as well and government changes in the Netherlands. I think they seem fairly committed to international accountability mechanisms, but it might take a while for example, the Dutch government to sign because of everything that's going on around it. And I'm sure other governments of states have possibly similar issues. So I think it will always take longer than we think, but maybe shorter than other courts. That would be my best guess.
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians are going to press for it very hard. I think it's a big political imperative for them, and the main issue is going to be money. There's already a bit of money, as we spoke about before, that's been pledged by the European Union to just get the ball very small rolling. I think it was 10 million, but that's going to be the big thing, is getting as many states to sign up as possible and to actually make some pledges. It is always, with these courts, it comes down to the dosh.
So we'll keep an eye on all that, and we'll keep our listeners posted with what we know about this as this develops.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.
Just to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and you'd like to give us a bit of extra support, you can head over to our Support Us page where you can give us a tip, or you can follow us on Patreon and you can download our newsletter. And we really appreciate everybody who gives us a bit of extra support there.